You are looking at the monument for Jefferson Davis, former president of and the only president of the Confederate States of America. This monument is in Irwinville, Georgia, which is in South Georgia. And the reason that this monument is here, because at this very spot, at this location, this is where Jefferson Davis was captured by troops from the United States of America. Now, he was the president of the Confederacy, and at that time, their headquarters, their capital, was in Richmond, Virginia. At one point, it was in Montgomery, Alabama, but by the time he ran, he was leaving from Richmond, Virginia. And the reason I say he was running was because the United States troops were closing in on his ass. You see, he was the one that oversaw the secession of the southern states from the rest of the United States of America. The reason that they seceded in large measure and mainly was because they wanted to continue and expand the right to own other human beings. That's right. They left the United States because they wanted to continue slavery. And that is the main reason that they left the country. Okay, so this man was over the Confederate States during the Civil War, all right? And the reason that he ended up here is because his armies kept losing to the United States Army, all right? And they were closing in on Richmond, so he and his cabinet members cut and ran. And he left Richmond. He made his way down south. And meanwhile, now this is in April. He started leaving, I think, in April of 1865. And his chief general at the time was a man by the name of Robert E. Lee. Okay? Now, Robert E. Lee, he kept losing his battles to General Grant, and he realized that continuing fighting would be futile. It would be a bad situation. So the honorable thing that Robert E. Lee did was he surrendered. He surrendered his forces to the United States and General Grant, okay? Well, Jefferson Davis didn't. He didn't agree with that. So he left Richmond, told his troops to continue fighting, and he kept trying to appoint chief generals to run the war, but everybody that he appointed ended up surrendering to the Union. And the reason why was because they knew that they were taking a butt whipping. But not him, not this man. He did not surrender to the Union from an official standpoint. Rather, he cut and ran, ended up in Georgia. Him and his troops, his small gathering of troops, ended up in a place called Washington, Georgia. And supposedly, he and the troops had the Southern Treasury with them, meaning he had a lot of gold, right? I mean, millions of dollars in gold, all right? Well, when they met in Washington, Georgia, they split up. And Jeff Davis and his small band, they were trying to escape and make their way down to the coast so he could catch a boat to Cuba and continue the fight. At this point, now mind you now, at this point, Sherman had made a swath through the state of Georgia on his way to the coast. I mean, just whomping and whomping. And the war was lost. The war was lost, but he just did not want to admit it. Okay? So him and his little small band, they ended up here in Irwinville, Georgia. And I guess he thought that he was cool, right? But one of the dirty little secrets that is forgotten in American history, or is very little told, was that not every white Southerner was for seceding from the Union. And he just happened, he must not have done his homework, because when he ended up here, he must not have realized that a few months before, Irwinville had seceded from Georgia. And they established what was known as the Republic of Irwinville, right? And they declared themselves back into the Union on their own. They said, we don't want to be a part of this secessionist stuff. We want to be part of the United States of America, right? So they declared the Republic of Irwinville. They had some Confederate militiamen come to these people, trying to get them to abandon the notion of being reinstated to the Union. And guess what? Some of the citizens of this county, of this city, Irwinville, they beat the crap out of those Confederate militiamen, ran them out of town, right? And one person that I want to give special attention to is Willis Bone. Mr. Willis Bone was a leader of the Republic of Irwinville movement. Okay, he was a white Southerner, but he was a fair Southerner. And this man stood up for, he hid deserting Confederate troops. He took care of sick and injured Union troops, and he supported and hid out escaped slaves and provided food and shelter for those people. Now, these are the stories that you don't hear about with white Southerners when the story is told, because they don't want you to know that there were people who were willing to risk their lives to do the right thing. Okay? So Mr. Willis Bone was one such person. In fact, Mr. Willis Bone was a miller. He owned a grist mill. And in that mill, he was hiding slaves. So the story goes that there was a slave catcher trying to bring in a slave that was a formerly enslaved person that was hiding at Mr. Willis Bone's mill. And this man walked on Willis Bone's property looking for this enslaved person, and Mr. Bone killed him. He killed him, and the Confederates ended up capturing Mr. Bone, and they hung him. And this was about a couple of months before Jefferson Davis made his way down here with his little encampment trying to hide from the Union. But too late. I believe that some of the local citizenry alerted the Union Army that Mr. Jefferson Davis and his crew were hiding out here. So the Union approached him and his family, his wife. They surprised him, and the rest of the contingency. They surprised him. Davis, either he was so cowardly and scared, or I don't know what else to say. He must have been scared. When he found out that the Union was attacking him, he puts on his wife's coat, and according to his wife, she put a shawl over his head, as you would see with older women, and had him walk out dressed in her coat and her shawl. And they surrounded him with enslaved women who had water buckets, as if he was going with them to seek water, as opposed to being the president of the secessionist forces that were fighting against the United States of America. Well, this ruse did not work, because one of the Union soldiers saw beneath the coat that he was wearing men's boots, and he caught him. He was like, "Hey, what are you doing?" And rather than going out in a blaze of glory, like Tony Montana. He was captured, like I said, in this shawl and in this coat without much resistance. And he went out more like Hannah Montana, okay? So they caught him. They ended up locking him up, and he stayed in jail for like 2 years, but he was never charged with treason. And I think that is a shame, but it is what it is. And I'm going to show you this park here in Irvinville, dedicated to this man. It's the Jefferson Davis Park. It's beautiful. See, we're in wiregrass country. This is the wiregrass portion of the state of Georgia. And it's kind of flat with undulating greens. It's not great for growing a lot of agriculture. So they didn't have a large contingency of enslaved people. So they can afford to, not be dependent on the evils of slavery. And I'm gonna show you this flag that's with this monument. All this stuff was put up by the Daughters of the Confederacy, right? And they're the ones that spread that myth about the lost cause, that there was some honorable cause that the South went to war about, not explicitly telling you that they decided to leave the Union because they wanted to continue to own and expand the ownership of slavery in America. So that flag that you see is different than the one that most people think of when they think of the Confederate flag, because that flag was the battle flag of Northern Virginia. This flag was one of the official flags of the Confederacy. It was called the blood-stained banner. The reason it was called the blood-stained banner is because of that red stripe at the very end. They had to add that stripe later because their original flag was just that stars and bars and that white background. But that white background looked too much like a flag of surrender. So in order to them to seem like they're still willing to fight, they had to put that red stripe to let you know that we weren't giving up. We still wanted to get our ass kicked. And that's how that came about. All right? So I don't understand why Confederate sympathizers hold this man in high regard, because even as he was trying to make his way to Cuba, he urged the Confederates to keep fighting. Now, he's not willing to risk his life for the cause, but he was willing to send the sons of the southern states to die at the hands of one of the most hardcore armies that ever existed, and that is the Army of the United States of America. He was willing to sacrifice those people's kids, but he wasn't willing to make that sacrifice himself. But yet still, they put monuments up for this man, and they have a big monument up in Stone Mountain, Georgia, which eventually I'm going to get to, with him, General Robert E. Lee, and Stonewall Jackson. As I mentioned earlier, at least Lee had the dignity and honor and sense enough to surrender like a man, bravely, to the opposing forces. And General Stonewall Jackson, at least he died in battle. He was killed by his own troops. He was fragged, but at least he was on the battlefield doing something, but not this man. Yet still, they make monuments for him. Kind of ironic.